Venezuela, once the richest country in Latin America, once its showcase, its modernizing cities were admired, its democratic government was praised around the world. Today, it is the first country that comes to mind when people speak of food and medicine shortages, frequent power outages, political turmoil, hyperinflation, and economic collapse. The system is at a standstill. Store shelves are empty. Bread costs one price in the morning, another by evening. Money fills bags, having lost all meaning. And life dissolves at the same speed as money loses its value. This is not the story of a country collapsing. This is the story of a system in which money has died. And this story does not belong only to Venezuela. Welcome to Code 404, Economy, where the historical codes of money are revealed. The truth is always hidden in the details. People in Venezuela did not wake up poor one morning. Their salaries were deposited into their accounts. Banknotes were in their pockets. Numbers still appeared on screens. But the system was no longer working. Venezuela's story does not begin with poverty. On the contrary, it begins with wealth that arrived too early. A country with the largest oil reserves in the world was, at the beginning of the 20th century, an ordinary agricultural society. Then, in 1914, the discovery that would change its fate was made: oil. That discovery would transform Venezuela into a completely different country within a few decades. After oil was discovered, it took several decades for Venezuela to secure a significant position in the global oil industry. By the 1930s, Venezuela had become one of the world's largest oil exporters. After World War II, global demand for oil surged. Venezuela stood exactly at the supply point of that demand. By the 1950s, income per capita had risen to levels comparable with prosperous European economies. Caracas rapidly modernized with oil revenues. Wide boulevards and highways were built. Consumption increased. Foreign brands entered the country. Caracas came to be known as the Miami of South America. But in reality, all of this was an illusion. This wealth was not based on real production. Industry did not develop. Technology investment remained limited. Productivity did not increase. Yes, there was oil, and oil seemed to be enough for everything. At least, that is what people believed. The 1970s are remembered as Venezuela's golden years. Global oil prices skyrocketed due to events such as the Arab-Israeli War and the Iranian Revolution. Venezuela's revenues broke records. For a time, it was even believed that Venezuela would become one of the richest countries in the world. But no one asked the critical questions: what happens if the oil runs out? Or more importantly, what happens if oil prices fall? History shows this pattern repeatedly. Easy money prevents people from thinking about tomorrow. By the 1980s, oil prices began to fall. That was the moment Venezuela's true condition was revealed. Its revenues were overwhelmingly dependent on oil. As oil prices fell, state revenues declined, but spending could not be reduced. Society had become accustomed to high wages, subsidies, and state support. You cannot simply take prosperity away from a population. That is politically impossible. And at that point, the decision history has shown us again and again was made: buying time with money. Venezuela did not arrive at this point overnight. History is full of such examples. First, borrowing increases, reserves are used, temporary solutions are sought, then reforms are postponed, reality is denied, and finally, money is printed. Venezuela followed this exact path. At first, the government tried to conceal the truth for several years. They burned through reserves to defend the currency. They attempted to keep the bolivar fixed at 4.30 to the dollar. But the balance between income and spending was unsustainable. And then, the day of reckoning arrived. The date known as Viernes Negro, Black Friday, was Friday, February 18th, 1983. The government was forced to make a painful decision. They announced they could no longer defend the currency. The bolivar was devalued, and the 4.30 exchange rate, a symbol of Venezuelan stability for decades, vanished overnight. A new exchange rate system was introduced, but the reality was clear. The currency had collapsed. And this was only the beginning. The 1980s are remembered in Latin America as the lost decade. For Venezuela, it marked a slow and painful process of impoverishment. The state was bankrupt. International banks no longer extended credit because they knew they would not be repaid. Poverty in Venezuela arrived as the natural consequence of artificial wealth. There was oil, but there was no system. To understand this process more clearly, we must look closer. In 1973, oil-producing countries in the Middle East imposed an oil embargo. Prices exploded. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Wealth flowed from the United States and Europe to OPEC countries. Venezuela was one of the founding members of OPEC. This transfer of wealth made Venezuela extraordinarily rich. During this period, Venezuela's president, Carlos Andrés Pérez, declared that Venezuela would become a first world country within a decade. Under the economic plan called La Gran Venezuela, he sought to nationalize the oil sector. On January 1st, 1976, at the Zumaque No. 1 oil well, the oil industry was officially nationalized. This marked the birth of Petróleos de Venezuela, the state company responsible for oil exploration, production, refining, and exports. At first, this was seen as a success. For 2 decades, PDVSA became one of the most respected national oil companies in the world. It expanded refinery capacity abroad, including in the United States, and maintained high levels of production. As oil revenues increased, the government announced ambitious development projects, expanded public services, and implemented extensive social programs. Venezuela became one of the wealthiest countries in South America. But behind the scenes, the country's productive structure was collapsing. Import dependence hit Venezuela hard. With money, everything could be bought. There was no need to produce. First, agriculture collapsed. Fields were abandoned. Farmers migrated to the cities. They survived on state assistance. Import dependence was followed by borrowing. You might ask, why would such a wealthy country need to borrow? Because oil was believed to be endless. Oil prices were expected to rise forever. There was no need to postpone projects. That was the mindset. The Venezuelan government borrowed to finance massive infrastructure projects that exceeded the budget. It borrowed so people could continue importing luxury goods. Corruption reached terrifying levels. Borrowing became a way to conceal the corruption that was draining the treasury. By the late 1970s, Venezuela ranked first in the world in per capita debt. The culture of easy money enveloped the entire country. As long as oil prices were high, Venezuela appeared strong. Debt did not seem like a problem. But when oil prices fell, the foundation of the system was exposed. There was no production, there was import dependence, and the state had no reflex to create solutions, because it had never needed one before. By the late 1970s, the oil market began to reach saturation. New oil fields in the North Sea and Alaska came online. OPEC's monopoly weakened. As Western countries increased energy efficiency, oil demand declined. Oil prices stopped rising, but debt payments continued. The loans Venezuela had taken were tied to variable interest rates. The lenders were U.S. banks. Meanwhile, the United States raised interest rates to fight inflation. For Venezuela, the picture became disastrous. Rising interest rates caused external debt to explode. At the same time, the oil market was collapsing. Revenues fell rapidly, while expenses rose even faster. When the first crisis hit, decision-makers faced a brutal choice: cut spending or print money. Throughout history, almost every system has chosen the same path: money. Wages could not be cut. Social programs could not be reduced. Public backlash was unacceptable. The solution seemed simple: print more money. Venezuela first burned through reserves to keep the bolivar afloat. But eventually, it accepted defeat and abandoned the fixed exchange rate system. People's savings evaporated overnight. Those with foreign currency debt saw their obligations multiply. The psychological collapse was devastating. Creditors demanded repayment. Debt was restructured again and again, but never truly resolved. Debt was used to pay debt. In 1989, Venezuela turned to the International Monetary Fund. The IMF prepared a $4.5 billion rescue package, but it came with strict conditions. The program known as El Gran Viraje, the Great Turn, was implemented. State-owned enterprises were to be privatized. Price controls were lifted. Fuel subsidies were removed. Citizens of an oil-rich country would no longer enjoy cheap fuel. The situation was dire, and the conditions were accepted. From 1983 to the late 1990s, this painful process was not merely a lost decade for Venezuela. It was the final nail in the coffin of the old system. The public had lost faith in traditional political parties. In 1999, Hugo Chavez rose to power on top of this very wreckage. Venezuela had treated the oil beneath its soil as wealth. Trusting it, the country had mortgaged its future. When conditions changed, it became clear that this was not wealth, but illusion. The wealthy country of the 1970s fell into debt in the 1980s, and today, the painful bill of that era is still being paid by a new generation. The idea that natural wealth can actually weaken a country sounds illogical. How can wealth become a curse? Yet history is full of such examples. Because large and easy revenues distort countries in 3 ways. First, the culture of production disappears. Second, the state becomes the center of everything. Third, the need for accountability vanishes. This is exactly what happened in Venezuela. Oil was sold. Foreign currency flowed in. The state spent. But that spending did not create new industries. It did not increase productivity. It did not invest in the future. It only purchased the present. Every economic collapse has a moment, a line that is crossed. Beyond that line, reforms are not enough. Aid is not enough. Time is not enough. In Venezuela, that moment was when trust completely vanished. People began to think, this money will lose value tomorrow. That is when the game ends. Because money is not a government decree. Money is a social agreement. And once that agreement is broken, no law can restore it. Millions of people left Venezuela. This was not panic migration. It was the exhaustion of hope. The young left, the educated left, those who could produce left. And that made recovery even harder. Because a country can print money, it can borrow, but it cannot easily bring back human capital. So why hasn't Venezuela recovered? This question is often asked. The oil is still there. Why hasn't it improved? Because the problem was never oil. The problem was trust. Once money dies, investment does not return. Savings do not return. The system cannot be rebuilt. The first step must be accepting reality. But that is politically the hardest step to take. Venezuela's story is not the story of a country. It is the story of a mechanism, and that mechanism does not recognize borders or geography. When money dies, the middle class disappears. Savings are erased. Future plans collapse. But worse than all of that, the sense of justice dies. As it has throughout history, this is exactly what happened in Venezuela. Venezuela's story tells us this: dependence on a single resource is not wealth. Money is not wealth. True wealth is investment in production, in people, and in the systems that sustain them. If this video gave you a new perspective, subscribe. The answers are hidden in history's codes. We reveal them.